In civil litigation, the defendants often raise affirmative defenses in answers to complaints or motions to dismiss. An affirmative defense lets a defendant escape liability regardless of whether the facts in a complaint are true. For instance, if a plaintiff files a complaint late, a defendant may raise the statute-of-limitations defense with the goal of avoiding liability altogether. In Coleman v. Frierson, the defendants took the better-late-than-never approach to affirmative defenses and raised them after the jury's verdict. For over 20 years, Samuel Coleman worked as a police officer for the Village of Robbins. After he retired, the village's board picked Coleman to work as a special investigator to look into corruption on the village's police force. In this role, Coleman was a police officer. Coleman uncovered corruption on the force that also implicated the mayor, Marion Smith. Then, Smith abolished the force and fired Coleman. Though Coleman wasn't being paid, he kept investigating and sharing his findings with the board. The board renewed Coleman's appointment, but Smith refused to sign the paperwork. Months later, the force was reestablished, and Gordon Frierson became the police chief. The village rehired about half the officers, but didn't rehire Coleman. Coleman continued to investigate and uncovered evidence that Frierson was corrupt. After Coleman reported his findings about Frierson, Coleman was arrested for impersonating an officer, but the charges were later dropped. Coleman sued the village and several officials, including Smith and Frierson, for wrongful termination and retaliation. Because local government employees committed these acts, Coleman brought his claims as civil rights violations under Section 1983 of Title 42 of the United States Code. During the litigation, Smith and Frierson failed to comply with their obligations to participate in the litigation. As a result, the court issued a default judgment against Smith and Frierson on liability. This meant that a jury wouldn't need to decide whether Smith and Frierson were liable. Instead, the jury only needed to determine Coleman's damages. The jury awarded Coleman over $500,000. After the trial, Smith and Frierson asked the trial judge to ignore the verdict, declare them the winners, and vacate the default judgment. The motion included affirmative defenses. The judge decided the motion.